Good afternoon. My name is Monica Himes, and on behalf of the University of Kentucky, welcome to the main stage. So our next conversation will be led by an artist, a professor, a poet, and a publisher of 11 collections of poetry. He is a founding member of the Appalachian Poets. Please give a warm welcome to Frank X. Walker. Welcome. Frank is joined by the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning novel March and the international bestsellers Caleb's Crossing, People of the Book, and Year of Wonders. Today she'll be discussing her latest novel, Horse. Please welcome Geraldine Brooks.
All right. Well, I don't know if these are book lovers or horse lovers. You hear that? Both. And if you love both, how could you not love this book? I'm looking around for, is Anastasia in this crowd? I've been talking with people about this book even before this moment even happened. I think they didn't even know I was connected to this conversation, but I have a friend, Anastasia, who's a horsewoman and an equestrian, and this is leading to the first question. She talked about how many times she was moved to tears in this book because of the clear love relationship between man and beast. And not just the horse, but I think even the relationship with the dog. If you've had a peek at the book jacket, you know that this is not an accident. Could you open up by sharing with this audience something about how you come to understand that relationship between man and beast, or in this case, an appreciation for horses, or the language of equus, as you would say?
Thank you, Frank, for being in conversation. Your poetry is so amazing and so moving, and I feel reading it that I can hear these incredible voices from the past that you have resurfaced and inhabited in your poetry. I came to horses quite late. I always loved animals. Animals were a very big part of my childhood, but it was little ones, cats and dogs. We lived in the inner city in Sydney, and horses were not a thing that one saw very often, except perhaps when the mounted police went by. And that was an experience of some embarrassment to me, because my mother would always run out into the road with a dustpan to see if she could score any manure for her rose bush. So that was the sum total of my horse experience. But then, sensible people, if you're going to become horse crazy, you do it at 5 or 15. When you still bounce if you fall off, and everybody falls off, of course. Well, I didn't become horse crazy till I was in my 50s, and I don't recommend that. But I was at a writer's retreat, and there were beautiful horses on this ranch, and one of the wranglers said, "You should come on a trail ride." And I said, "I can't come on a trail ride, I can't ride." And he said, "Yes, you can. These horses know their job, they won't let you fall off." And so I had an ecstatic experience riding through the arroyos in New Mexico. And I came home and I mentioned it to a young friend who was over for dinner a couple of nights later about how much I had loved this. And she said, she looked out the window and she said, "You've got a couple of acres. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." A free horse. So, there are a lot of questions I should have asked, but I didn't, and ended up fencing half my property and turning my tool shed into stalls, and learning about horse transport, because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But it didn't matter, because she was beautiful. She was a Palomino, and she was so beautiful she'd been in a TV commercial. It was for a fast-acting cream that treats vaginal yeast infections. Horse Palomino gallops across the Mexican Altiplano, and the voiceover says, "Some things should be fast." Anyway, as soon as the horse arrived, that was all I wanted to think of. All I cared about, thought about was saddle fitters and farriers and riding lessons and da-da-da. I wasn't getting any actual work done. And meanwhile, the free horse was costing a fortune. So, but that's where the love comes from, is this horse obsession that started to absorb me in, I call it my midlife crisis, So some people get a Mustang sports car and I got a horse. But I tried to give all the feelings that I have about my horse and my dogs to the characters in the novel. And so that's where that comes from.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's clearly very genuine. If you've read, raise your hand if you've already read the book. That's half this audience. The rest of you are in for quite a treat. There's so much in the book that feels so amazingly authentic and genuine. I have to ask you, how much of Geraldine is in Jess?
Oh, such a lot. Because when I heard about Lexington, the horse, and the incredible racing career of Lexington and what happened in the Civil War, and I realized this was a novel for me, but I thought it was going to be a novel about a racehorse. And the minute I started to research it, I encounter the extraordinary story of the Black Horsemen who were responsible for Lexington's early success and his care and the love of him. And I found Harry Lewis, the great trainer, and then the rather mysterious figure of Black Jarrett, Lexington's groom. And when you know horses, you know that the groom is the one with the intimate relationship with the horse. So I knew he was going to be central. And you realize that this obsession of the 19th century, this incredible industry that was the source of wealth and prestige for so many white thoroughbred owners, was built on the plundered labor and expertise of enslaved or formerly enslaved Black horsemen. So suddenly this book about a racehorse also becomes a book about race, and I've got a lot of responsibility and a lot of work ahead of me to do right by these characters, and there's so much to research there. So I wanted to give myself a break and have one character that I didn't have to research. And so Jess, who is an osteopreparator at the Smithsonian Institution, happens to be an Australian who just came to America on a lark because she had a scholarship to graduate school, ends up getting a great career opportunity in a field that she loves, and she's very socially awkward and totally blockheaded and misunderstands so many things about the United States and its history and race relations, and she's me.
Well, I think she's should be one of the easier characters to cast when this is a movie. I'm sure it's on the way to the big screen. When I think about the other characters, personally, and for selfish reasons, I was struck by the amount of poetry in the book, and not just by the narrator speaking, but the references to poetry. Several times there was recitation happening in the middle of the story. There's one particular passage I recall where Jarrett is comparing the Mississippi River to a racehorse, and it's so striking and beautiful. I wanted to throw the book across the room because I didn't write it, and it was just that damn good. And so first, thank you for all poets for including such rich language and making poets feel so welcome in the text. But can you talk about the intentionality behind that attention to language before we get to details, but the language itself, the richness of it? I don't know that everybody comes to large tomes like this novel expecting so much poetry. Could you just talk about how or why that's important to you.
Poetry is incredibly important to me. I start my writing day by pulling not an anthology of poetry off the shelf and letting it fall open to any page and just reading that poem. That is kind of like my workout, because you, the poets, are the Olympic eventers of poetry. You're the ones who are going over the incredible jumps, who are able to get the horse to turn on a dime, who can go hell for leather over all kinds of difficult terrain. Whereas I think of the novelists as, you can maybe do a trail ride on a quiet pony. So that's the way I think about it. But you talk about my description of the Mississippi River. You've got the most beautiful river poem in here. This is When Winter Comes is about York, who is the black guy who's in the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this is a collection of poetry that reads like a novel. I don't know if I could ask you to read the river poem.
I think that's breaking a rule, right?
Yeah?
If there's time at the end, but
Okay.
they're here for the horse.
Oh, come on. I mean, only if you want to. Can you? I didn't mark where it is, but when you mentioned the river, I just thought this. Yeah, it's so beautiful. I was just reading Frank's work to my mother-in-law, who's not real well at the moment, and she's always loved poetry so much. And she was just lying there, and she just had the biggest smile on her face. So I was hoping I could put some smiles on your face too.
Sure. Thank you for that embarrassing moment. But I'm going to read from When Winter Comes. This is a poem called The River Speaks. And it's in the imagined voice of the river. With the epigraph from Langston Hughes that says, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Call me the Ohio, the Mississippi, or the Missouri. Call me Wood, Teton, Yellowstone, Milk, Judith, Marias, Jefferson, Madison, Beaverhead, Bitterroot, Snake, Clearwater, or Palouse. Call me the wide-toothed mouth of the Columbia River. Call me after my many creeks, my great falls, my hot springs. I am the snow atop Mount Adams. I am the salty hope in the air at Cape Disappointment. I am she who is the deep and the shallows, a thundering waterfall and a quiet storm. I am always present in the air, on every tongue, in every drop of milk and blood and tear. You will find me in every thorn and flower, seed and fruit. There is no life without me. I am libation and baptismal pool. I am your sprinkle of holy water. I am older than man and light. I am of God, not God, but like God. I am also inside of every man, for all are born in me and formed there until they are flushed naked into the world. And I remain there in them like God until they depart and return to dust. Captain Clark saw me as a great wet road that could be conquered with the rowing and paddling of men under his command. So I showed him my many rapids and waterfalls, made his men carry their own boats and supplies around me for miles at a time. These were the good years. White men had not yet studied the beaver and learned how to redirect my paths, manage my flow, harness it for their own use, attempt to enslave me too. Captain Lewis was different. To him, I was a piece of art. He marveled at the natural fall of my waterlocks and felt humbled by the beautifully carved rock masterpieces that adorn my canyons and walls. While I have at most been an open way for the white man, to the red man I have been viewed as a helpmate, considered a wife, carrying their salmon and trout, providing for their transportation and nourishment, surrounding them, moving through them in the heat of the sweat lodge, answering their prayers when they danced. But the black one was the only one taught to both fear and respect me. And though I was the road that carried the ships of death to and from Africa's shores, I became the waiting, outstretched arms for those who refused to be enslaved, for those who trusted me to rock their babies off to sleep. My ocean floors are covered with his people's resistance. I carry their spirit in every splash I make. Their humming, their lost voices, their last words have become a part of my sweetest songs. When he is whole, again, when York knows what he is worth, I will well up inside of him, and he will hear them sing. Thank you. All right. So you must return the favor. I'm sure by now on this amazing tour that you're having, you have some favorite passages that you like to read. Before you choose your passage, how do you decide what to read? Do you wait till you see an audience, or do you already have it pre-packaged in mind based on how much time you think you have? That has to be difficult, with that many pages, to decide what to read.
You know, I don't actually read very often because I think that the magic of a novel is how you hear it in your own head. I feel it's very different with poetry. It's such a privilege to hear the poet read their own poem. But to me, that relationship between what I wrote down and what you hear in your head, I don't want to get in the way of that, so I only read if somebody makes me.
Would you like to hear a read?
Well, I haven't got a book, so. Oh, shoot. Okay.
So take your time looking for a space, and I'll just remind the audience that in about 14 minutes or so, we're going to take your questions, and we'll only have about 15 minutes, so that probably means about 3 of your questions. So be prepared. Look for the person with the microphone who will be roaming with a beautiful pink and white T-shirt on that says books, books, books. Because she can't find everybody, but she'll probably find the quickest hand up. So you want to practice, just stick it up there. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to respond to that.
There are other bits that I might have read for this audience, but just because we have very short time, I'm just going to read a little bit from early on, and it's about the birth of a foal, actually. And it turns out to be a very important foal. When they reached the barn, they found Alice Carneal strutting restless circles in her stall, her coat glistening with sweat. Harry and Jarrett took their places out of her line of sight. Harry spoke to her in a low musical voice, almost a hum, telling her how good she was and how great her foal would be. The sound was soothing, and as the evening lengthened, Jarrett felt himself drifting in and out of a doze. He came awake to the splash of the mare's water breaking. She gave a low groan and folded herself gently into the bedding hay. Harry knelt beside her as the birth sack bulged. The tiny crescents of the hooves were clearly visible through the pearly membrane, folded daintily, one atop the other, soles down in the correct position for an uncomplicated birth. Sure enough, when the forelegs were out almost to the knee, a slick, wet muzzle followed, the foal in perfect position, arranged like an arrowhead. The shoulders, the widest part of the foal. Harry hummed on, encouraging Alice. He could see the little white hooves straining the membrane of the birth sac. Minutes later, the sac split and the foal sluiced forward. A tiny horse slipped out onto the hay like a gift from a package.
Thank you. If you're looking for more than a horse story, but this beautifully, lyrical prose, you find it on every page. I mean, it's not this slow walk on a workhorse. Thoroughbreds all the way through this. I also wonder if I couldn't help but mention the fact that I live 3 blocks away from what would have been the Kentucky Association racetrack.
Oh, wow.
In the east end of Lexington, where horse Darley wins his first race in 1853. A lot of people know the story of Lexington, or they think they know the story of Lexington, but they don't know the whole story. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your commitment to telling a version of the story and its relationship to what people recognize as the truth.
So to me, one of the, I couldn't do this work if I wasn't resting on the hard labor of real historians. And fortunately, I came to this story when real historians had started excavating the truth of the contribution of the Black Horsemen. So I had that work to lean on. And one of the interesting things that one of these historians had posited about Lexington is, what is the meaning of saying that Harry Lewis, the black trainer, owned the racing qualities of this horse? And there's a set of rules of the association racetrack that belonged to Captain Viley, who was part of the syndicate that bought Lexington. And in that set of rules, he has put a mark against one rule that says no black or mulatto may race a horse on this track. And yet Harry Lewis owned the racing qualities of Lexington, but Lexington had to race as Alicia Warfield's horse. So who really owned that horse? So in the novel, I've taken a leap of imagination and put this in the context of so many other things that were taken away on the basis of race. So that's one example, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm also curious if you might help us understand the challenges you had of time traveling. In this book, in one chapter we're in 1850, and then we may be in 1919, and then 1950. But you go back and forth, and I think as a reader you don't get lost, and that has to be challenging. What's your secret? How did you make that happen?
So it was kind of awful, actually, because I had no idea how the sections were going to fit together. I knew from the beginning that the spine of the book was going to be the 19th century story of the racehorse. But I wanted to have a contemporary section that would reflect on the science around the horse's bones, because, as you all probably know, Lexington's skeleton, after he died, he was such a celebrity. It was the skeleton was mounted and put on display in the Smithsonian in Washington. And I just got really interested in the whole business of osteopreparation and how they do that. And that took me out to, some of you, all of you maybe have been to the great museums on the Mall, but that's only the tip of the iceberg of what the Smithsonian has. 98% of the collections are out in this campus in suburban Maryland, where there are all these scientific research labs in every discipline you can think of. And there's a lab specifically dedicated to preparing bones for scientific study. So I went out and talked to the young scientists who worked in that lab. And while I was there, a curator from the art department came and said, there's a painting of this horse. And would you like to see it? So she took me to see it. It wasn't on public display. And she said, it's got a really interesting provenance. I've never looked at this before, but this painting of Lexington came to the Smithsonian in a bequest from Martha Jackson, who is a famous gallerist in 1950s New York, who championed the work of the most avant-garde artists of the day. She was an early supporter of Pollock and de Kooning, and everything else she gave to the Smithsonian is an edgy piece of contemporary art, except for this one traditional 19th century horse portrait. Why did she have that? So then I suddenly had a third section of the novel that had grabbed hold of my imagination. What was Martha Jackson's connection to Lexington? And so it became a triple braided narrative. But until very, very late in the writing, I loved each of the stories. I had no idea how they connected. And I'm starting to sweat. You know, I'm 6 years into writing this book, and I've got 3 separate stories that I like and no idea how to link them. And I just kept writing, and then suddenly there was this eureka moment. Oh, that's it. That is the connective tissue. And then I went back and wove them together. But I had to take it on trust that I was going to figure it out, and I was just lucky I did.
Well, we're glad you did, and that's what somebody applauded. Please applaud that effort, because it works. I see a few heads nodding when I talked about the time travel and how seamlessly it moved back and forth in time, and how the characters, you know, for me personally, I was really attracted to the character Theo, but I also was curious as to not how you made it fit in, but it seemed to be very important to the overall narrative. Could you talk a little bit about?
Well, I knew once I understood that I was going to be writing this story about race in the 19th century, and knowing that the book had a contemporary story as well, I just realized I can't leave the story of race in the 19th century as if this is all over and done with and we don't have to bother our pretty heads about it now. But you know, it's very fraught as a white woman to be writing about the lives of black characters. And, you know, there are all kinds of important discussions about appropriation and whose story is it to tell. And I was aware that I was walking along this edge, and I just relied on the incredible generosity and patience of black friends who are willing to sit down and share their lived experience with me and help me create the character of Theo. But I was pretty attached to him too. Yeah.
Well, we won't give any spoilers, so I won't say more about that. But thank you for Theo. Thank you for all those characters. I think we probably only have time for one more question from me before we open it up to the audience. Maybe talk a little bit about how your background as a journalist has served you in not just writing fiction in general, but it seems that all of your characters are an expert in something. That we learn, each of them teaches us something very specific and detailed that we're excited to learn. And I wonder how much of that is because of your background in journalism.
Yeah, you got me there. It is true. I love to get up in other people's business. And that's what journalists get to do every day. You go to work and you don't know who you're going to just barge in on and say, tell me all about it. And I loved every step I took as a journalist. I did that for 15 years. I worked for the Wall Street Journal as a foreign correspondent. And you're always barging into other people's lives and relying on their generosity to share. But people actually do love to talk about what they do. So often you're knocking on an open door in that regard. And I certainly found that to be true at the Smithsonian. People were incredibly generous there. I think having been a journalist first is helpful in a number of ways. Loving the research part of the work is... I think the other most useful thing is you're not encouraged as a journalist to believe in writer's block. You cannot be calling your news editor and saying, I can't file that story because the muse did not arrive today. And I think it makes you treat writing as a job. You go to your desk like everybody else has to go to their workplace, and you put in the hours and you sweat, and it's not very good most of the time. I have a friend who's a sculptor. Her name's Sarah Z, and somebody asked her about her process, and I loved what she said. She said, my process is mess, 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 mess art. And I just thought, yes, that's what it is, because you can't make art every day. You know, you're lucky when you can make art, but you can make a mess every day. And you go to your desk and you make a mess every day, and out of that mess, something emerges. So, yeah.
Thank you for that beautiful lesson.
Perfect. Great.
And I know some of my students are within earshot that does not give you permission to bring in bad poem, bad poem, bad poem, great poem. I think the mic is moving, so
That's
raise your
right.
hands if you have a question.
Absolutely. If you have a question, raise your hand. Monica and I, you met Monica at the top of the session, we'll bring the microphone to you, so just let us know where you are.
And
Frank,
don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Frank, if you have another question while we're looking. Oh,
There we
we
go.
got
There are a
two
couple of
right
hands
here.
over here.
All right, let's go,
All right.
Monica.
Look to your right.
Is this one
We
working?
got you.
There's a mic.
Doesn't matter. I don't. Is it on? Yeah. I don't know much about horses, but like it overate and that did its eye in, or what happened? Was that hereditary thing that it could pass on, or?
Yeah, so I don't want to, for those who don't know the story of Lexington the horse and who haven't read the book yet, I don't want to do any spoilers on this, but I can tell you that for the part of the book that you're talking about, I talked to about 6 specialist veterinarians, and they all had a different theory. So I don't know for sure. But it is true that the skeleton had a very odd malformation. And at first, the preparators at the Smithsonian thought it was a mistake that the articulator of the skeleton back in the 19th century had made. And then they realized it wasn't. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
This is a question for both of you. What books have you read recently that really spoke to you, that you either enjoyed or were inspired by?
I'll go first. I just finished this amazing book called Horse.
That's cheating.
And she says it's not cheating. For me, and I told Jordan earlier that most people don't know that I'm not a successful poet. I'm a struggling fiction writer. And I've been struggling for almost a decade on a manuscript that I think, for me personally, I think has failed because of my difficulty in time travel. I didn't know how to time travel in this book back and forth. I mentioned to her earlier that I think I learned how to time travel reading this book, and so many other things about, incorporating poetry and prose in the same space. I'm honestly excited and looking forward to getting back to work on that manuscript just because I had a chance to sit with this book and learn so much from it. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
I would say the most recent novel that just blew my hair back is The Overstory by Richard Powers. And I don't know how many of you might have read that book, but it is extraordinary. And it's a very poetic meditation, but it's a great novel where he brings disparate strands of story that you can't believe will ever connect, and he connects them in the end. It's like an orchestra, with the separate instruments all coming together. And to me, it just changed the way I looked at the natural world. I put down that book and I went outside, and I had this completely different set of eyes on what I was seeing. And then my youngest son read it, and he told me that he went out and hugged the oak tree in our backyard. So it's very powerful. I highly, highly recommend it. And then I would just add that I reread some Hilary Mantel when she sadly passed away, and I think her Wolf Hall trilogy, it was so exciting for me to read a work of historical fiction that was really a classic being created as we were watching her write it. And, what she did in that book I admire so much, because she just inhabits Cromwell and his time on a kind of molecular level.
And what was the name of those books again? The first one was?
The Overstory, and then the Wolf Hall trilogy. All 3 books in the trilogy are sensational.
There you go. So
I have a question, if I may. I know everybody's still thinking of their question, but Silas House was just on the main stage prior to you arriving, and he talked about this incredibly difficult schedule that he is on. He's on a travel schedule right now of 26 cities in 20 days. It's crazy. Can the both of you talk to that aspect of being a writer and when you're put on the road, how that affects your family, your health? What comes into play, because you've written great works and then you got to get out there and come to a festival like this. So can you speak to that?
Well, mine's easier. I just write poetry, so there's not much demand for poetry, except in Kentucky. It's a big deal in Kentucky. I just spent a week in my hometown of Danville. We just had the 8th annual Frank X. Walker Lit Festival for some reason. And I think I did 5 presentations in 4 days, but it was in my hometown, so it didn't feel like anything. It was like breathing, being in those spaces. So that can't hardly compare to taking a plane to each individual experience.
You know, it is such a weird thing because for 5 years you're sitting alone in a room. You see no one. You're in your sweatpants. You don't go to the hairdresser. You never get a leg wax. and then suddenly, oh my God, there's a photo shoot, and they're coming and they're ironing your hair for a photo shoot, which is completely ridiculous. And then, as you say, you're on the road and you're meeting people and you're up on stages, and you know this quiet, isolated life that you lead the rest of the time bears no relation to what happens when the book comes out. But how lucky am I that people give a shit, you know? And as I'm being groped by the TSA every morning, you know, for weeks, you're just grateful that somebody wants to read the words that you've written. And it's also a kind of fantastic way of seeing the country in time lapse. You know, you see that city was really beaten down 5 years ago, and now it's had a resurgence, or boy, that one's really running off the rails. And you know, so it is really, it's just, it reconnects you with the rest of America in a way. When you're living out on an island off the coast of Massachusetts, this is not exactly a wide spectrum of American life.
Other questions? Okay, great. Right up here. Thanks, Monica.
Speaking to that, how has it been being in Lexington, in Kentucky, when you've just written this marvelous book?
Well, you know, it is. First of all, you know, I was here first in June when the book first came out, and it's very nerve-wracking the first time you go back to a place that you've written about. And I had this experience with my very first novel, which is even less my business than this is, because it's in England, and it's a little village in the Peak District in Derbyshire. And I had taken their precious story of what happened in that village when bubonic plague struck in 1665, and I'd taken it and I had written this novel about it, and then I'm coming back to present on it in that town. And we drove in, and on the village green is a set of stocks, and I thought, are they going to put me in those? But luckily, they embraced the book, and I'm feeling a pretty warm embrace here in Lexington, so I'm very relieved about that.
Frank, I think Monica's got one down in the front area there, and then we're going to come back over to my side. So go ahead, Monica.
Thanks. With such a vast cast of characters, you've already explained the inspiration for what was probably the easiest character of all for you to create, and that was Jess. And I'm thinking Theo is one of the most difficult, but I'm wondering if you could say something about the characters that were more difficult than others for you to recreate.
Well, I think the one that I felt the most responsibility to and the one that I love the most is Jarrett, because we don't really know much about the real Jarrett. We know that he existed because there's a painting which is lost. Nobody's seen it for 100 years as far as we know, but it's described in great detail as the greatest painting that Scott ever did. And it's Lexington in his old age being led out by Black Jarrett. And so I went to try and find Jarrett in the historical record. And he's there. You can see he starts getting paid. Alexander of Woodburn Farms started paying people after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was not the general run of how things went, because Kentucky wasn't really included in that, but he did it. And so you can see Jarrett getting paid, but what it was like to be him, what his real life was, that was not accessible to me. And so I took what I could find about people like Jarrett. Ansel Williamson was a great source because his life was a little bit better documented. He was the great trainer. He trained Aristides, who was a son of Lexington, who won the first Kentucky Derby, ridden by a black jockey. There are a couple of oral histories from the Relief and Works Project where people who had worked with horses spoke in their own words. But you have to take all of that with a grain of salt, because a lot of the interlocutors doing the interviews were white, so how frank could people really be in telling about their experience? Anyway, lots of different sources trying to create a possibility of his life.
We have time for one more question, and I'm over here. Frank, if you can see me. Sure. All right, here we go.
Thank you for being here. I used to live on a horse farm that has the two Triple Crown winners there right now, so I know a little bit about it. But the thing that pointed out to me that I really want to know about, you said in the book that after the Civil War, black jockeys could no longer get mounts for some time. Can you address that and let us know the people that gave you that information, how they felt about that?
So this is something that Frank can speak to probably with greater authority than I can. But like a lot of things that happened after the Civil War, there was a tremendous reaction to Reconstruction. And what happened in the racing industry was that the incredible skills of the now free blacks were pushed out of the industry or pushed down into the stables and the backstretch. So great trainers ended up just looking after carriage horses and things of this nature. And but the jockeys were the most imperiled because the white jockeys ganged up on them and made it unsafe for them on the track. And that's very easily done, as you would know. And luckily, there are a couple of wonderful books that document this. Frank, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think Kentucky's neutral status in the Civil War is kind of a misnomer because the Confederacy had a large and very strong presence in Kentucky to the point where many politicians after the Civil War campaigned in their Confederate uniforms in order to get elected. That says something about the culture in Kentucky. And the thing that's really important is that it was so unsafe for those jockeys to continue riding that many of them, because they didn't have retirement plans. If you got hurt as a jockey, you were done for life. So a lot of those better jockeys went abroad, went to Canada to live and to work because the industry changed that much. And if you think about who was comfortable here, think about how present the cavalry was in the Confederacy and those horsemen relocating and coming back home to Kentucky. And, the following Reconstruction was post-Reconstruction. And part of that was I hate to use this phrase, but this commitment to taking their country back, which meant suppressing the earlier voices. I think what we've seen in the United States with what happened after Obama's 2 terms was kind of a pushback against that kind of advancement. And the same thing just repeats itself historically. And it happened, and in a very matter-of-fact way in the horse industry. You can see it. It's well documented, and it's not fiction. Thank you for your question. Thank you guys for being an amazing audience.
Amazing, thank you.
And thank Geraldine Brooks for an amazing book.
Thank you, Frank.